Welcome to History for the Tired, where we drift through time in slow, soothing steps, signfolding the past not with urgency, but with presence. In this episode, we begin our journey into the heart of an ancient city on the brink, before the Roman legions circled its gates and flames kissed its holy stones. Jerusalem was a place full of ordinary breath, sacred rhythm, and the murmurs of daily life. This is Streets Before the Siege, an immersive walk through Jerusalem as it once was, before war reshaped its walls and its people forever. So, lay back, close your eyes, let the sound of history carry you. And if you enjoy stories like these, don't forget to follow History for the Tired. A new journey waits with every quiet night. Morning in the city of peace. The sun was barely rising, yet the limestone walls of Jerusalem glowed with a golden hue, as if the stones themselves remembered every dawn that had come before. In the upper city, roosters called out from the courtyards of the wealthy, while in the lower quarters, the first clangs of trade rang out through the narrow alleys. This was a city older than memory, where prophets had walked, kings had ruled, and the voice of God had once been said to fill the temple like smoke. But today, it breathed intention. Despite the calm of early morning, the scent of smoke from distant Roman outposts drifted faintly on the wind. The war had not yet reached the walls, but its presence was felt in whispers. For now, Jerusalem endured in its rutina city, clinging to daily life, even as the future loomed like a gathering storm. Children fetched water from the pool of Siloam, giggling as they balanced clay jars on their heads. Their mothers were already shaping dough for the day's bread, using stone mills to grind barley and wheat brought in by the last caravans. In the marketplace, merchants prepared their stalls with dates, figs, salted fish, and linen dyed deep indigo. The hum of Aramaic and Greek mixed with Hebrew prayers drifting from open windows. Even in times of unease, Jerusalem was a place of layered identities. In the same street, one might see a Pharisee quoting scripture, near a Roman tax collector counting coins, beside an Edomite craftsman selling incense burners. The city was sacred and contentious, beautiful and burdened. Here, tradition and rebellion existed side by side. The Temple Mount stood at the city's heart, its gleaming facade visible from nearly every district. Pilgrims had begun to arrive for the coming festival, adding to the press of bodies on the stone roads. In the court of the Gentiles, philosophers debated while money changers clinked silver denarii and Tyrian shekels across stone tables. Above them, priests in white linen robes moved solemnly, preparing the early offerings. In the residential quarters, a family gathered for a morning meal of lentils, olives, and honey-dipped flatbread. The father, a scribal teacher, murmured a psalm while his wife poured watered wine. Their youngest son, no more than 6, traced Hebrew letters in the dust beside the table. Across the courtyard, a neighbor's goat bleated as it was led down toward the communal pen. Jerusalem, for all its sacredness, was a living city. It smelled of sweat, spice, burning oil, and damp stone. It echoed with prayers and arguments, the clatter of sandals, and the cries of beggars. And yet, beneath the ordinary, there pulsed a shared anxiety. Rome, distant yet ever present, was growing less patient. Zealots muttered in back rooms, and the city, though proud, was already a tinderbox. But in this moment, before the siege, before the fire, and the famine, Jerusalem breathed in the light of the rising sun. Pigeons circled above the temple. A baker's boy chased a stray dog through an alley, and the city of peace, so often torn by war, lived another morning. High noon, in the city of contrasts, as the sun climbed higher, casting sharper shadows between the white stone walls of Jerusalem, the city's rhythm shifted. Morning's hush gave way to the midday crescendo of labor, worship, gossip, and unspoken fears. In the market squares, voices rose above the din of clinking coin and bleating animals. Fishermen from the Sea of Galilee argued prices with innkeepers. Traders shouted offers in Greek, while a woman from Moab bartered for herbs wrapped in palm leaves. Midday was the heart of Jerusalem's social life. Narrow alleys pulsed with movement, vendors hawking wares, messengers darting with wax-sealed scrolls, and musicians playing flutes to distract from the heat. Camels groaned under heavy loads, their breath misting in the sun as they were watered at community troughs. In shaded colonnades, elders sat with fans made of woven reeds, discussing not only scripture, but the tightening grip of Roman rule. The temple's grandeur loomed over all, a sacred anchor to both city and soul. Within its vast courtyards, worshippers gathered for prayer. Trumpets blew in solemn blasts as priests sprinkled sacrificial blood upon the altar. The scent of incense, frankincense, myrrh, and cinnamon rose like a smoky bridge between man and the divine. Pilgrims touched the massive stones of the outer wall, whispering prayers through trembling lips, but tension simmered even in holiness. The temple, once a symbol of unity, had become a fault line. Zealots condemned the priestly elite as collaborators with Rome. Sadducees defended the rituals and hierarchy. Pharisees argued for the law, while Essenes withdrew from the city altogether, disgusted by its corruption. And always, the Roman eagle loomed its standards, paraded through the Antonia fortress by legionnaires in armor, a foreign power watching a holy people. In the Jewish quarter, a mother stitched garments by a window, while her daughter spun wool beside her. Their neighbor, a widower, read aloud from the scroll of Isaiah, his voice crackling with age. Across the street, a group of children reenacted the Exodus using palm fronds and clay figurines, their laughter briefly erasing the sound of distant hammering, more defenses being added to the city walls. Farther east, beyond the bustling lanes, the Mount of Olives offered respite. Farmers from the surrounding villages rested under ancient trees, sharing dates and bread. Some brought animals for sale, goats with matted fur, doves in red cages, lambs wrapped in coarse wool. From the ridge, one could see all of Jerusalem, domes and courtyards, smoke drifting from chimneys, the golden flash of the temple roof. A traveler arriving from the north paused to wash his feet in a cistern. He'd heard rumors of legions marching south, of villages burned, of cities falling like stones into the sea. But Jerusalem stood defiant, like a lion surrounded. The walls were high, the people proud, and the temple still beat with sacred life. Yet, for all its resilience, there was unease. Food prices had risen. Some wells ran dry. Whispers of revolt stirred the air. And still, in the middle of it all, daily life continued. A scribe copied letters with ink made from soot and wine. A group of men debated over whether to tithe on cumin. A midwife delivered a baby in the lower city, wrapping the newborn in linen, whispering prayers of protection. The heat deepened. Shadows grew short. In the court of the women, songs rose as families offered thanks. But in the corners of taverns and quiet rooms behind shops, men met in secret planning, plotting, warning. And above them all, the city stood a place sacred and scarred, where noon brought both blessing and burden. afternoon shadows, and sacred routines. The shadows lengthened slowly over Jerusalem as afternoon approached, stretching across limestone walls and dusty walkways like ancient fingers. The once lively city now softened into a quieter rhythm. Heat shimmered above the rooftops, and most vendors pulled down cloth awnings to shade their stalls. Women returned home with baskets of lentils, cucumbers, and flatbread wrapped in cloth. The clamor of business yielded to the lull of rest. Within the stone homes of the upper city, curtains were drawn to block the sun's blaze. Children napped beneath thin linen covers, while their parents sat in shaded courtyards, sipping watered wine or date syrup. In wealthier households, slaves fanned their masters or poured chilled water over clay pots to keep them cool. The rooms, designed to catch the breeze, held a quietude rarely heard during the bustling morning hours. In the lower city, where space was tight and alleys narrower, families crowded into shaded doorways. A group of young girls plucked lyre strings while their grandmothers sang softly, reciting tales from Torah and memory. Across the alley, a boy carved tiny animals from olive wood. The scent of roasting lentils drifted through the air, mingling with the earthy fragrance of fresh-cut thyme and charred pine used to heat small stoves. Beyond the homes, the temple district remained active. Afternoon was a time for personal petitions and secondary sacrifices. Devout visitors moved from one chamber to another, guided by priests and temple guards, their sandals scuffing across sun-warmed flagstones. The red and purple curtains of the inner sanctum fluttered as wind passed through the sacred halls. The Levites continued their chants, voices low and rhythmic, harmonizing with the occasional ring of a bronze censer. The temple was not only a religious space, it was an epicenter of Jerusalem's culture, economy, and debate. Near the court of Israel, scribes sat in semicircles, discussing matters of halakha, while their students listened in rapt silence. One scribe argued passionately about laws of ritual purity concerning water drawn from certain cisterns. Another about the ethics of buying land during wartime. A Pharisee shook his head with amusement, while an Essene scoffed from the edge of the crowd, refusing to engage. Meanwhile, in the shade of the colonnades, elderly men leaned against cool marble, their fingers tracing the edges of carved stones. Many had seen the city before Herod's renovations, before Roman governors walked its streets. To them, the grandeur of the new temple complex was both awe-inspiring and unsettling. "Too much gold," one muttered. "Too many eyes from Rome," said another. But even as skepticism lingered, so too did reverence. A father brought his son to offer 2 doves as thanks for surviving a fever. Nearby, a couple in matching wool robes lit candles and spoke a prayer for fertility. Tears and incense mingled in the air, as heartfelt as any sermon. Back in the city's artisan quarter, potters worked with wet clay, their wheels spinning slowly. One shaped a water jug for a Samaritan traveler. Another etched delicate patterns into a wedding bowl. In the tanner's lane, a less pleasant odor clung to the air rawhide, soaking in lime, waiting to become sandals or scroll covers. Life in Jerusalem was tactile and physical, a mix of the sacred and the gritty. Young men hauled crates of dried fish and amphorae of oil from the city gates, checking them against tallied lists scratched into waxed tablets. Laborers paused beneath fig trees to wipe their brows, and among them all, the city hummed not loud, but steady its pulse, as old as the stones beneath their feet. Yet, not all was peace. In a shadowed corridor behind a spice shop, a group of men met in whispers. These were not merchants or scribes, but zealots men who spoke of revolt not as theory, but as promise. "We cannot serve both Caesar and God," one said. Another unsheathed a small dagger. "We will remind them who we are." Such conversations were becoming more common. The Roman governor had increased patrols, and recent crucifixions had been staged near the Damascus gate as warnings. But many in Jerusalem, especially the young and angry, no longer heeded Roman threats. Elsewhere, a Roman centurion and his cohort passed through the city gates, their armor gleaming. Children peered from behind stalls, whispering as the soldiers moved with disciplined steps. A street performer paused his juggling act until they had passed, only resuming once the last gladius disappeared around the corner. As the sun drifted westward, the sky took on soft hues of bronze and dusty pink. Birds returned to roost beneath tiled eaves. Shepherds called to their goats beyond the Geneth gate. In the city, oil lamps began to flicker to life. One by one, the households of Jerusalem lit tiny flames to hold back the darkness, and still, daily life continued. A girl embroidered the hem of her wedding robe. A baker kneaded dough for the evening meal. A young boy was taught how to bind a scroll. And all the while, the city of Jerusalem, so sacred, so fragile, waited in twilight. Twilight whispers and sleepless streets. As dusk fell across Jerusalem, the city softened once more, shifting from the hum of labor to the hush of transition. The last light of the sun bathed the white stone walls in a soft amber hue, casting long shadows across uneven streets. Windows flickered with oil lamps, and smoke curled lazily from hearths. The rhythms of the day began to fold into evening rituals, and the city, ever ancient, turned inward. In the residential quarters, families prepared the evening meal. Fires crackled in stone ovens, and the smell of spiced lentils, roasted chickpeas, and grilled fish filled the air. Children, their hands and feet still dusty from the day's play, gathered around low tables covered with woven cloths. Bread was broken, hands were washed, and blessings were spoken aloud with familiar cadence. "Baruch atah Adonai," murmured fathers, giving thanks over wine and food. In households of scribes and scholars, recitations of the Psalms mingled with the aroma of cumin and coriander. Evening marked the return of calm for most, yet for some it was only the beginning. On rooftops, women spread linens and looked toward the Mount of Olives, watching the changing sky and listening for the distant cry of jackals. Elderly men sat near doorways, sharing news from the marketplace, rumors of troop movements, and memories of more peaceful times. In wealthier homes, musicians played stringed instruments, while guests reclined on cushioned benches, sipping watered wine and debating scripture or city politics. At the temple, the final sacrifices of the day were completed. The priests moved with solemn precision, pouring wine libations and burning the last offerings. The golden menorahs inside the sacred court were lit, their flames dancing against walls inscribed with ancient texts. A hush fell across the precincts as twilight deepened. Worshippers slowly departed, heads bowed, hearts heavy with both devotion and worry. Outside the holy grounds, beggars settled into their usual spots, beneath colonnades and arches. Some recited fragments of Torah to passing pilgrims in hopes of coin. Others simply rocked and hummed, soothed by repetition. In alleyways, lamps cast a dim glow on shuttered stalls and locked doors. Cats slinked through shadows, and the city became a quieter, more private thing. Night in Jerusalem was not without its dangers. With the city gates closed, patrols began their rounds. Some were Roman guards, others Jewish sentries loyal to the temple authorities or various political factions. Zealots and rebels often crept from meeting places under the veil of dark, carrying coded messages or stolen weapons wrapped in cloaks. The tension that had simmered all day now settled like a pressure on the chest, unspoken but present. In one corner of the city, a group of artisans met in secret. They had family in the north, where the war had already begun. Their talk turned from taxes to tactics, from prayers to the price of iron. Across the city, in a modest courtyard, lit by a single lamp, a rabbi taught his disciples about the story of Job. "We are like him," he said, waiting, watching, enduring. As the moon rose high, its pale light cast the temple in a silvery glow. From afar, it looked eternal, but within its courts and beyond its walls, uncertainty lay thick in the air. A mother rocked her infant to sleep while whispering verses of comfort. A father checked his food stores, counting jars of oil and sacks of grain. The siege had not yet begun, but Jerusalem lived with the knowledge that it would. And yet, the city did not stop living. Love letters were still exchanged in secret. A young couple stood in a dark garden, whispering dreams of marriage and escape. A potter cleaned his tools with careful reverence, placing them beside his sleeping children. A boy watched the stars from his rooftop and asked his grandfather to name the constellations. Night deepened. A wind stirred the olive trees. Dogs barked and fell silent. And through it all, Jerusalem dreamed sometimes of angels, sometimes of exile. The city that had seen kings rise and empires fall, that had cradled prophecy and passion alike, now stood at the edge of another chapter. By midnight, most households lay in slumber. Only the watchmen and the restless remained awake, walking the quiet paths between light and shadow. Somewhere beyond the horizon, legions stirred. But here, within these ancient streets, life pulsed on, fragile, resilient, sacred. The city of peace waited in the dark, breathing, listening, and enduring. The siege begins. Spring of 70 CE, the morning of Passover in the year 70 CE began with a deceptive stillness. From atop the Mount of Olives, Roman commanders surveyed Jerusalem through narrowed eyes, the spring air sharp with anticipation. Around them stood thousands of legionaries, their metal glinting under a pale sun. Standards fluttered in the breeze. Drums beat at intervals, slow and steady, like a heartbeat of something ominous. Inside Jerusalem, the atmosphere was far less ordered. The city, swollen with Passover pilgrims, pulsed with chaos. Every home, every courtyard, every roof was filled. Some had come to worship, others had come to fight, and many were trapped in between, neither soldier nor supplicant, just citizens trying to survive. Factions within the city vied for control. Zealots, sicarii, moderates, and temple guards all drew their lines and sharpened their blades. The Roman general leading the siege was Titus, son of the newly crowned emperor Vespasian. A seasoned commander and calculated strategist, Titus did not intend for a swift storming of the city. He intended to squeeze it slowly, methodically, until surrender or ruin. By early April, he began constructing 3 camps, encircling Jerusalem, forming a triangle of steel and discipline. His goal was simple: sever the arteries of Jerusalem's life, fits, food, water, and hope. Inside the city walls, the people watched from towers and rooftops. Farmers who had once worked olive groves now stood with makeshift spears. Priests who once moved gracefully through the temple now prayed in whispers between alarms. Children clung to their mothers as the distant sound of Roman hammers rang through the hills. The siege had not yet begun in full, but its shadow already fell across every heart. Jerusalem's defenders scrambled to prepare. Though outmatched in training and equipment, they had something the Romans lacked: the fierce knowledge that this was their home, their sanctuary. Stone walls were reinforced. Arrows were fletched by the thousands. Boiling oil and pitch were prepared. At night, Jewish fighters lit signal fires and sang psalms beneath the stars, their voices trembling but defiant. The Temple Mount remained the heart of the city, both a beacon of faith and a target of war. During these early days, sacrifices still continued. Incense still rose into the air. The priests still dressed in white, moving through their sacred duties with a surreal calm, as if war could be kept at bay by ritual alone. Outside, rebels argued strategy. Inside, tradition endured. As April turned to May, Titus made his first major move. He ordered his legions to construct a siege wall nearly 5 miles long around the city's perimeter. This encirclement, completed in just 3 days, was an engineering marvel and a psychological blow. With it, all exits were cut off. No more supplies, no more messengers, no more hope of escape. The people inside began to understand the true nature of siege. Hunger crept in, prices soared. Water, once abundant from cisterns and wells, became precious. Fistfights broke out in bakeries. Families bartered heirlooms for a handful of barley or dried figs. Some began eating their leather sandals. The streets that once sang with prayer and trade now echoed with suspicion and despair. Still, there was resistance. Raiding parties made daring sallies out of side gates. Archers shot flaming arrows at Roman siege towers. Zealot leaders, charismatic and reckless, proclaimed that God would not allow his city to fall. And for many, that belief offered strength. After all, Jerusalem had endured the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Seleucids. Why not Rome? But Titus was patient. He observed, he adjusted. He unleashed a psychological tactic few had seen before. He began crucifying any Jewish refugee caught trying to escape. Up to 500 prisoners a day were nailed to wooden crosses, their bodies displayed on the hillsides. Their cries, their twisted forms, were visible from the walls. It was a message: no mercy, no escape. Inside, food dwindled further. People tore pages from scrolls to boil them. Leather belts became soup. Children cried themselves to sleep with empty stomachs. And yet, the temple continued its rituals. The shofar still blew. The incense still rose. In some way, the sacred persisted. By the end of May, Jerusalem was a city at its limits. The first breaches in the outer wall were met with frantic battle. Flames and arrows flew across night skies. Death became familiar, then routine. But surrender was not an option, not yet. Not for the keepers of the covenant. Not for the last defenders of the sanctuary. And so, the siege ground on, breaching the walls, blood and stone. By June of 70 CE, the siege of Jerusalem reached a new crescendo. The city's outermost wall, first of its 3 formidable defenses, had fallen after weeks of Roman pressure. Titus, always measured, now prepared to break the second wall, the barrier protecting the heart of the city and the temple itself. As the siege intensified, Jerusalem's defenders fought with increasing desperation. Each street was a battlefield. Women carried water past corpses. Children hid in cellars that had once stored grain. By night, the fires of rebellion burned on rooftops. By day, black smoke smeared the skyline as Roman catapults flung great stones into courtyards and synagogues alike. Titus, unwilling to risk the lives of too many of his own men, employed every tool of Roman siegecraft. His engineers built rams and towers, each larger than the last, their wheels groaning across bloodied earth. Ballistae hurled massive bolts into the city's heart. Fires were used not just to destroy, but to demoralize. The defenders turned every stone and alley into a line of resistance. Boiling oil rained from rooftops. Narrow passages became killing zones. Women and old men joined the fray, hurling stones or wielding blades carved from plows. Inside the city, however, unity crumbled. The Zealots, Sicarii, and other factions turned on each other, assassinating rival leaders and torching storehouses of grain to deny them to Enemizeven when those enemies were fellow Jews. Titus observed this chaos with grim satisfaction. His enemy weakened itself, yet Jerusalem still stood. In July, the Romans breached the second wall. Street-by-street fighting erupted. Roman soldiers, once proud and ordered, found themselves disoriented in the winding maze of stones. They underestimated the ferocity of defenders fighting for every doorway. Casualties soared. For every Roman who climbed a ladder, another was dragged down and beaten to death with rocks. The very stones of Jerusalem became weapons, but the Roman tide was relentless. They advanced, step by brutal step, deeper into the city. The Temple Mount, once distant and serene, now loomed just beyond reach. By mid-July, a blood-soaked silence fell across much of the northern city. Fires raged unchecked. The air smelled of ash and fear. The Romans stood poised for the final assault, and still the temple stood. Temple fires, the final assault in August of 70 CE. The Roman army moved like a storm cloud over the Temple Mount. For weeks, Titus had tightened the noose around the city's sacred heart, and now only the inner temple complex remained beyond his grasp. The air in Jerusalem was thick with ash, and the screams of hunger and war had become the city's only music. The temple, Herod's masterpiece, stood gleaming despite the carnage surrounding its white marble, blinding in the sunlight, its golden roof shimmering defiantly. For the Jews of Jerusalem, it was more than a building. It was the dwelling place of their God, the symbol of an eternal covenant. Titus, himself ambivalent about destroying such beauty, ordered his men to keep the temple intact if possible. But in war, commands often dissolve in chaos. Roman soldiers, enraged, exhausted, and driven by revenge, swarmed the outer courts. Blood splattered the sacred stones. Defenders, knowing what the fall of the temple would mean, fought like spirits possessed. According to later accounts, a Roman soldier, perhaps drunk, perhaps wild with zeals, snatched a flaming torch and hurled it through the temple's window. Flames caught instantly, fed by the wooden interiors and dry summer winds. The sanctuary, echoing with centuries of prayer and song, ignited. Panic swept through both invaders and defenders. Some Jews hurled themselves into the fire rather than let the Romans desecrate the sanctuary. Others tried to douse the flames or rescue scrolls and sacred objects. The high priests, draped in charred robes, perished on the steps of the altar. Titus rushed to the scene, furious that the fire had begun against his orders. But the blaze had its own will. The inner sanctum, once believed to house the Ark of the Covenant, now became a furnace. The temple veil torn in two. Gold fixtures melted and pooled in cracks between the stones. The next morning, the temple was gone. Only smoldering blackened walls remained. Jerusalem wept in silence. The destruction of the temple marked more than a military victory. It was the collapse of a world. Judaism, once centered around sacrifice and the holy precinct, would never be the same. The priesthood was extinguished. The rituals ended. The Romans raised their standards over the ruins. The eagle stood where once the cherubim had guarded. Victory chants echoed where prayers had whispered. Titus would later parade in Rome with sacred vessels and slaves, including, many scholars believe, the menorah. But in that moment, among the smoke and cries, even he seemed somber. He had won the city, but at the cost of something irreplaceable. Jerusalem, once called the city of peace, had fallen. Ashes and aftermath, a city of ghosts. When the sun rose after the destruction of the temple, Jerusalem was no longer the city it had been. The second temple, the beating heart of Jewish life and spirituality, was reduced to scorched ruins. Smoke lingered in the air for days, carrying the bitter scent of ash, blood, and unspoken sorrow. For those who survived, the city was a graveyard. Streets, once bustling with pilgrims and merchants, were now cluttered with corpses. The cries of the wounded echoed off the broken walls, mingling with the distant chants of Roman victory. Families searched for loved ones, many in vain. A mother lifted a shattered doorframe, hoping to find her child beneath. An elderly man clutched a Torah scroll, not knowing where to carry it. The Romans, efficient in their conquest, soon moved to extinguish the last sparks of rebellion. Survivors were rounded up. The young, the skilled, and the strong were sent to Rome. Tens of thousands would later die in the amphitheaters, killed for sport, beneath the roar of cheering crowds. Titus walked through the ruins solemnly. He may have wanted a peaceful resolution once, but the devastation under his command would define his legacy. The general who destroyed the temple, the man who humbled Jerusalem. In the weeks that followed, Roman engineers and soldiers began leveling sections of the city. The few towers that remained were spared, not out of mercy, but as monuments to Roman power. Josephus, the historian and one Srebel-turned defector, wrote that Jerusalem was left so bare that future travelers would scarcely believe a great city had ever stood there. But even in the silence, stories survived. In the shadows of ruins, whispers passed from elder to child, of the high priests and their final prayers, of the temple's last embers, of heroes who stood until the end. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical. The Jewish people faced not only a destroyed capital, but a shattered worldview. Without the temple, how could worship continue? Without Jerusalem, what remained of the covenant? Yet amid the despair, seeds of resilience were planted. In nearby Yavne, Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, spirited out of Jerusalem in a coffin during the siege, began reimagining Jewish life. He established a new center of learning, shifting the focus from temple sacrifice to study, prayer, and the preservation of the Torah. What was meant to be the end became a new beginning. Meanwhile, in Rome, preparations for a massive celebration were underway. The Arch of Titus would soon rise, commemorating the victory. The spoils of the temple, including the golden menorah, would be paraded through the streets. And while the Emperor Vespasian consolidated power, his son Titus basked in a hero's glow. Back in the Levant, silence covered the ruins like a shroud. But in that silence, a new form of Judaism emerged, one not dependent on walls or sacrifices, but on memory and law, text and identity. Jerusalem was not dead. It had become eternal. Whispers from the Holy of Holies. Beneath the dust and rubble of Jerusalem lies a mystery that has endured for centuries, the fate of the Ark of the Covenant, revered as the earthly dwelling place of the divine. This sacred artifact once rested in the inner sanctum of the first temple and was shrouded in awe, legend, and fear. But by the time the Romans breached the city's walls in 70 CE, the Ark had long vanished. Where did it go? Was it hidden, destroyed, or spirited away beyond reach? This is a journey not only into the physical ruins, but into the spiritual imagination of a people, longing to reconnect with their holiest relic. Through temple scrolls, prophetic warnings, medieval travelers, and coded rabbinical writings, we trace the breadcrumbs of a sacred mystery, one that continues to echo beneath Jerusalem's timeless stones. Theories of disappearance. From Babylon to Ethiopia, where the Ark might have gone, is a question that has generated a library of speculation. Some theories are grounded in historical context, others in religious tradition, while many hover somewhere in between the two. The Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, which brought the destruction of the first temple, marks the last time the Ark was definitively mentioned in historical texts. One prevailing theory holds that the Ark was seized by the Babylonians and taken to the capital, never to be returned. Yet, curiously, Babylonian records, so meticulous in other descriptions, never mention the artifact. Could it have been spirited away beforehand? Another hypothesis posits that faithful Levites, recognizing the approaching doom, concealed the Ark in one of the many subterranean chambers beneath the Temple Mount. Rabbinic sources hint at this possibility, citing Jeremiah the prophet as one who may have hidden it. The second book of Maccabees, a non-canonical but historically rich text, speaks of Jeremiah commanded by God to seal the Ark in a cave on Mount Nebo, never to be retrieved until a future time of restoration. Then there's Ethiopia nation that has long claimed custodianship of the Ark. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains that Menelik I, son of King Solomon, and the Queen of Sheba brought the Ark to Axum, where it resides in the chapel of the tablet under heavy guard. Outsiders are forbidden from seeing it, and only one guardian monk is ever appointed to watch over it. Modern scholars have tried to investigate this claim, but access remains restricted. While many are skeptical, the strength and longevity of Ethiopia's narrative have kept this theory alive. It blends biblical legend, royal genealogy, and political mystique into a deeply compelling vision of preservation beyond borders. In more speculative realms, fringe researchers have proposed that the Ark was smuggled to Egypt, hidden in the catacombs beneath the pyramids, or even that it lies under the Vatican. These ideas may lack archaeological support, but they reveal the human longing to believe that something sacred could survive even the worst of human conflict. No matter the theory, the Ark's disappearance remains one of history's most stubborn enigmas. But perhaps the greater mystery is why its story continues to call to us, why we still search for it. Beneath the Temple Mount, caves, codes, and censorship If there is one place the Ark of the Covenant is most often whispered to remain, it is beneath the Temple Mount itself. The sprawling platform, dominated today by the Golden Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, conceals a web of subterranean chambers and tunnels, many of which remain inaccessible due to religious, political, and archaeological sensitivities. According to ancient Jewish tradition, the Temple Mount was honeycombed with hidden vaults designed for the safekeeping of sacred relics and priestly treasures. These underground chambers, some of which have been discovered, some still lost, could plausibly have harbored the Ark, hidden by high priests aware of Jerusalem's approaching fall. Supporting this theory are tantalizing clues from rabbinic writings. The Mishnah, a compilation of Jewish oral traditions, redacted around 200 CE, mentions secret rooms beneath the temple used for safeguarding valuables. Even earlier texts hint at a divine instruction to preserve the holiest artifacts before disaster struck. One of the more controversial sources is the Copper Scroll, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in a cave at Qumran. Unlike the other scrolls, this one is etched in metal and lists locations of vast temple treasures hidden across Judea. Some scholars believe the Ark is among them. Others suggest it may be a decoy or a coded record written by Essenes or rebel priests attempting to preserve a dying legacy. Adding intrigue is the account of Sir Charles Warren, a British officer and explorer in the 19th century, who conducted early excavations near the Temple Mount. Warren documented narrow shafts, secret passageways, and abrupt dead ends beneath the surface, suggesting a complex network that had long been blocked or buried. He speculated, cautiously, that something of immense religious importance had once been concealed there. In modern times, excavations near the Western Wall have unearthed further evidence of vast subterranean systems, yet access to these areas remains heavily restricted. The Israeli Antiquities Authority, in coordination with religious authorities, halts any excavation beneath the Dome of the Rock due to the intense religious and political implications. This veil of secrecy has led to a host of theories and allegations, some claiming that secret digs have taken place under cover of darkness, others suggesting that knowledge of the Ark's location is intentionally suppressed by religious institutions. Conspiracy or not, the enduring mystery has become a lightning rod for messianic expectations and apocalyptic fears alike. For those who believe, the Ark still rests in the shadows, sealed behind stone, wrapped in silence, waiting for the time of return. The silence of guardians and prophecies return. If the Ark of the Covenant was hidden and not destroyed, it may not be merely a lost relic, but a carefully guarded secret across generations, in whispers and coded texts. There are mentions of guardians of the Ark select individuals or groups entrusted with its protection. In this final segment, we investigate whether its disappearance was the beginning of a long vigil, not just a mystery. Some traditions point to an unbroken chain of guardianship. In Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, the monks of Aksum speak of their sacred charge over the Ark, housed in the chapel of the tablet. These monks remain cloistered, choosing a single guardian monk who lives in solitude for life, watching over the relic. While critics point to the inaccessibility and secrecy as cause for skepticism, believers see it as fulfillment of divine mandate. In rabbinic lore, a legend persists that the prophet Jeremiah hid the Ark in a cave on Mount Nebo, commanded by God to preserve it from the coming Babylonian conquest. The cave has never been found, and those who seek it often report strange coincidences or spiritual unrest, as if the Ark is actively hidden, its place guarded by more than stone. More recent esoteric traditions, including Kabbalistic and mystical Jewish sects, believe the Ark remains in Jerusalem, but not in our plane of perception. To them, the Ark exists in a sacred, hidden dimension, accessed only by those with divine purity or spiritual insight. These teachings echo themes found in Christian apocalyptic writings and Islamic traditions about a hidden object of divine fire returning before the day of judgment. This idea that the Ark will return in a time of global reckoning is echoed in all three Abrahamic faiths. In Jewish belief, it may return with the Messiah to restore the temple. In Christianity, it has been linked to Revelation's vision of the Ark seen in heaven. In Islam, some scholars interpret Quranic verses about sacred objects to allude to the Ark's return as a sign of divine fulfillment. And so we wait. The Ark is not simply a lost artifact of ancient craftsmanship. It has become a symbol of yearning, a mirror of the sacred and the unattainable. For every scholar who seeks it in maps and scrolls, there are thousands who seek it in prayer. Perhaps, in the end, the Ark was never meant to be found, but remembered its silence, echoing louder than discovery. High priests and hidden agendas. To walk through the grand hall of the Sanhedrin was to walk through the very bloodstream of Jerusalem's power, seated in semicircle under ancient cedar beams and the ever-watchful Torah scrolls. These elders, chief priests, scribes, and Pharisees held authority that shaped the daily rhythm and spiritual pulse of the people. But beneath the polished wood and reverent tones, intrigue whispered. At the heart of this power web stood the high priest, a man more than ceremonial. He was both symbol and strategist. In 67 CE, the high priesthood was caught in volatility. Rome manipulated appointments. Factions fought to seize the role. Some priests were elected not by lineage, but by political bribes and Roman favor. In a temple supposedly divine, power had become transactional. We meet Matthias ben Theophilus, who, though a man of sincere ritual, was caught in games far greater than himself. He rose by the will of Rome, replacing predecessors deposed in shame. Inside the temple complex, he walked with visible devotion, yet behind closed doors, he navigated alliances, negotiated bribes, and placated Roman governors to protect the city's fragile autonomy. And then, in contrast, came the zealots. To them, men like Matthias were traitors, collaborators. They saw the priesthood not as sacred, but as defiled by compromise. As the war crept closer, Jerusalem's elite fractured. Priestly factions aligned with Herodians, Sadducees, and Romans. Others, especially among the Pharisees and Essenes, retreated into the hills or into secret prayer halls beneath the city. The temple was a place of incense, blood sacrifice, and divine presence, but it was also a stage. Gold gleamed under torchlight, choirs sang praises, but in the shadows, deals were struck. Some leaders planned how to delay Roman advance. Others debated whether to surrender the city altogether. Meanwhile, everyday citizens watched these power plays with a mixture of awe and fear. In the upper city, mansions clung to the hilltops, their walls adorned with mosaics, their halls echoing with political council and secret meetings. The lower classes, trapped in food shortages and conscripted labor, peered up at these stone towers and wondered what gods they truly served. As we journey through this part, you'll hear the hidden conversations, the veiled threats, the letters burned before sunrise. This was not just a city under siege from the outside. It was a city battling itself from within. Stay with us as we uncover the layers of thrones and dust, the fragile, gilded lives that shaped Jerusalem's fate. The wealth of towers and the weight of gold, the upper city of Jerusalem shimmered with privilege, elevated not only in geography, but in luxury and ambition. Marble-paved courtyards, pools surrounded by imported cypress, olive oil lamps burning late into the night as scribes inked family legacies. This was the world of the city's elite, the Sadducean aristocracy, merchant princes, and Herodian loyalists who thrived while the city strained under siege. By 68 CE, even as Roman legions choked the outer regions of Judea, life within these homes retained echoes of indulgence. The elite flaunted imported fabrics from Damascus, Egyptian glassware, and Roman bronze tokens of their alignment with empire. Their feasts continued, albeit quieter, guarded behind heavy doors and stone walls. Bread became thinner, wine more precious, but power still draped them like a garment. Inside one such villa, a wealthy Sadducee named Hanan sat beneath a carved cedar canopy. His family had served as priests for generations, yet he now operated as a financier and political broker. His dining room overlooked the Temple Mount, a symbol both of faith and of leverage. Hanan's sons moved between war councils and Roman camps. One offered support to the Zealots, another whispered surrender to Titus's envoys. Their household embodied the split loyalties infecting the city's elite. While others starved, these towers stored grain. While the city's water channels ran dry, private cisterns flowed. And yet, wealth could not wall off fear. Servants overheard desperate plans. Secret tunnels beneath courtyards led to escape routes or underground gatherings. Luxury met paranoia at every turn. Far below, in the valley districts and the overcrowded lower city, such opulence stirred resentment. Rebel factions raided these mansions when rations dwindled. Some elites bribed the sicarii for protection. Others found their gates burned, their possessions seized. Status became a liability. Jewels couldn't be eaten. Tapestries couldn't buy safety. Power painted targets. But not all the elite were silent. A few, like Queen Helena's descendants, opened storerooms to the public. A wealthy widow named Shira converted her villa into a makeshift hospital, taking in wounded fighters, regardless of faction. She kept records of the dead not by tribe or wealth, but by name, stitching identity back into a city unraveling. And yet, the contrast remained brutal. While refugees built shelters from broken carts, certain banquet halls still rang with soft harp music. While firelight flickered from rebel camps in the hills, crystal lamps glowed in perfumed halls. The towers stood not only as monuments of prosperity, but as mirrors of disconnect. This was Jerusalem's paradox in its final days. Thrones of stone, yet dust in the wind. Gold too heavy to carry, yet powerless to save. In the next part, we'll meet those whose wealth did not shield them, and those who chose to abandon comfort to fight for a city they could no longer recognize. Banquets before the burn, velvet curtains shivered with the evening wind as servants passed steaming platters through arched thresholds. Inside the banquet hall of one of Jerusalem's last standing noble estates, silver clinked softly against bronze as guests gathered not in celebration, but in desperation. With the Romans drawing nearer each day, the city's elite turned inward, not outward. They threw feasts, not to revel, but to distract. The host this evening was Judah ben Zakkai, a powerful and deeply conflicted figure among the temple elite. His family's legacy was etched into the very stonework of Jerusalem's priestly class. Yet Judah, educated in Greek philosophy and Roman diplomacy, understood better than most that this was not a siege that could be outlasted with mere gold or influence. The walls were closing in. Still, candles were lit in golden sconces. Dried dates and preserved olives were served beside watered-down wine. Musicians played subdued melodies from harps and flutes, muffled beneath the weight of impending doom. Here, amid conversations laced with Latin phrases and coded whispers, guests debated their fates. Should they flee to Herodium, send envoys to Titus, hide sacred objects within the temple vaults? Some still believed that divine intervention would come, that angels would descend from heaven to repel the invaders. Others, like Judah, had begun to see the collapse not just of walls, but of an era. One guest, Tamar bat Itan, a poet and widow of a zealot commander, sat quietly among the jeweled throng. Her presence was both scandal and symbol-proof that even rebel sympathizers found uneasy sanctuary in these opulent halls. She recited no verses tonight. She simply listened, her eyes flicking between silver goblets and guarded expressions. By midnight, the feast had grown tense. A servant slipped on a cracked mosaic tile and dropped a tray of figs. The sharp sound shattered the air, and silence fell like a curtain. It reminded everyone how close chaos now stood outside their polished walls. Later, as the guests dispersed under the cover of darkness, Judah moved to a private chamber where a hidden safe beneath the floor held not jewels, but scrolls, letters, prophecies, forbidden texts he hoped to preserve. "This city will fall," he whispered to no one, "but something must remain." Not far from his estate, fires glowed on the horizon. The Roman tents, arranged like a jawbone around the city, crept closer by the hour. In the next part, we will follow those who dared to walk away from gold and garlands, to join the dust of the streets and the fury of resistance. Bloodlines and the betrayed, when power turns to dust in the final hours of the ruling class's influence. When even whispers carried the weight of treason, power within Jerusalem was more illusion than fact. The great families who once stood tall behind temple veils and tower walls were now shadows behind shutters. What they clung to wasn't control, it was legacy, and even that was cracking. In the estate of Ananus ben Ananus, former high priest and once a political kingmaker, silence reigned. His name had once commanded armies of temple guards. His decrees sealed fates, but now he was a prisoner in his own marble hall. The zealots, having stormed the temple precincts, had labeled him a traitor. His wealth couldn't buy their favor, and his lineage meant little to men drunk on divine vengeance. Ananus's cousins, members of the priestly aristocracy, had scattered. Some fled to Roman lines under the pretense of negotiation. Others cloistered in villas in the upper city, hiring mercenaries and bribing rebel factions. Yet no amount of coin could insulate them from the storm that was both within and without. Yohanan of Giscala, a charismatic and ruthless zealot leader, had begun purging what remained of the aristocratic influence. He accused elders of cowardice, of corruption, of collusion with Rome. His rise was swift, his justice absolute. Priests who once presided over sacred rites now begged in the streets or lay rotting in alleys. Still, some resisted, not with swords, but with secrets. A woman named Shira Bat Malkiel, herself of Hasmonean descent, began sheltering orphaned temple boys and scribes in the crypts of her estate. She disguised herself in linen like a servant, smuggling food through aqueduct tunnels. She whispered psalms over sleeping children, praying they would remember something of their lineage when the city was dust. In another part of the city, a different betrayal was brewing. Matthias ben Bothus, a noble educated in Alexandria and once rumored to be a friend of Vespasian's son, secretly passed intelligence to Roman scouts in exchange for promises of safety. He believed his cooperation would secure him and his family a future when Jerusalem fell. But the Romans were not known for honoring promises to those who betrayed their own. As tensions reached their peak, internal battles among the rebels brought more devastation than Roman spears. Fires were set not by legions, but by factions fighting for control of a city already lost. In one grim night, storehouses of grain meant for the starving population were burned in a power play. Children died with crumbs in their hands, while gold-stitched robes were used as torches. The temple itself became a fortress. Its courts were trampled not by pilgrims, but by brawling men with makeshift armor. Blood ran where incense once burned. The high altar stood defiled, repurposed as a lookout for archers. And behind its walls, ancient families who once defined Jerusalem's elite huddled like fugitives. Not all would fall within the city. Some escaped through tunnels, bribes, or blind luck. They carried scrolls, rings, and stories. Many fled to Qumran, to caves in the wilderness, or even as far as Alexandria and Antioch. Among them were descendants of King David, Herodian bastards, and forgotten lines of temple scribes. The siege was not just a war against walls. It was a war against memory. Every noble house that fell was another erased chapter. Every priest killed was another broken link in the chain of tradition. As the Romans finally breached the Temple Mount, those bloodlines that had once shaped Jerusalem were gone or hiding. The marble homes were rubble, the lineage scrolls burned. But among the ashes, a few fragments survived, letters tucked in clay jars, names carved into oil lamps, symbols hidden beneath mosaics. Power, once cloaked in gold and authority, ended in betrayal and silence. And Jerusalem, stripped of its elite, entered a new chapter, one where memory had to replace monuments. In the next section, we leave the courts and bloodlines to explore the beating hearts and quiet paws of those who walked beside humans during war. We journey into Section 5, Fur and Fever, Healing with Animals, the silent watchers of siege and spirit. When the walls of Jerusalem groaned under the pressure of siege, and men fell by sword or starvation, there were others, quieter companions who remained. Dogs that once herded goats or guarded thresholds now roamed the alleys. Cats, once honored for keeping grain stores free of vermin, slinked through shadows of temples and tombs. In times of conflict, it is easy to overlook the animals, but they were there. They saw, they endured, and in many quiet ways, they healed. Even as families were torn apart, small children clung to their pets. In the lower market, amid the ash and ruin, a girl named Tamar was seen often with a scrappy terrier named Dov. She wrapped him in linen when the nights grew cold, whispering lullabies over his wiry fur as if he were her brother. The neighbors, what remained of them, said the child had not spoken to another human since her father was taken by the rebels. But she spoke to Dov every day, and he never left her side. In the courts of the temple, long before they became battlefields, doves fluttered freely. Some were bred for sacrifice, others were simply drawn by the scent of incense and bread. Children fed them crumbs while their parents prayed. But even as chaos overtook the sacred grounds, these birds remained. In stories whispered after the fall, people claimed that the doves circled above the ruins for weeks, as if mourning the home they had known. The Essenes, a sect known for their austere lives and ritual purity, were among the first to formalize a kind of sacred bond with animals. In scrolls hidden near Qumran, fragments speak of healing rites involving gentle birds, the use of goat's milk as salve, and the presence of trained dogs who accompanied the sick. To the Essenes, these creatures were not lesser beings, but earthly messengers of divine mercy. They believed animals absorbed suffering, that their presence was a balm against spiritual rot. Among the rebel fighters, animals served not only as company, but as comrades. Horses, of course, were crucial, though few remained by the final months of the siege. But even the lowliest foot soldier might carry a charm, a tuft of fur from a faithful dog left at home, or a pigeon feather tied around the wrist, believed to bring speed and clarity in battle. These small tokens became sacred. In a shattered courtyard once belonging to a wealthy merchant, a small sanctuary had formed not of people, but of animals. A woman named Yael, a former midwife turned caregiver, had collected injured creatures abandoned by the fighting. A limping donkey, a hawk with one eye, three-legged cats. She called them her silent choir. At night, she lit an oil lamp and recited psalms, each verse a balm for beast and soul alike. Word spread. Soon, even hardened zealots visited her, not for medicine, but for a moment of peace, to stroke fur, to feed grain, to remember gentleness. Romans too brought animals into the siege, not just war dogs, but mascots. A centurion was known to keep a tamed wolf pup. Another had a trained falcon that perched on his shoulder. These beasts were more than curiosities. They were living shields against despair, reminders of order amidst carnage. When the falcon died during a skirmish, the centurion wept openly, a scandal to some, a revelation to others. It was said that during the great fire at the temple, a young boy and his monkey, a gift from a trader once passing through, were seen fleeing through the smoke. The boy, already orphaned, had refused to abandon his companion. The pair disappeared into the lower tunnels and were never found. But in the months that followed, stories of a temple monkey who survived the flames became a strange comfort to many. Children drew pictures of it on walls. Women swore they heard its chattering near the ruins at night. It became a symbol not of madness, but of stubborn hope. Scrolls recovered later mention herbal treatments that mimicked animal warmth, poultices named for the softness of lambs, teas brewed to calm nerves like a purring cat. In these formulas, humans reached for the language of animals to describe healing, because often the presence of animals did what no chant or medicine could. They anchored people to the earth, reminded them that life continued. The Roman historian Suetonius, writing years after the siege, noted in a letter that among the Jewish captives brought to Rome, some insisted on bringing their pets. A woman from the Galilee carried a cage of doves. An elder kept a lamb with him, claiming it had licked his wounds clean after a raid. These details were meant to amuse his Roman audience, but they tell a different story to Ustat. Even in chains, people clung to the creatures that offered comfort when the world turned cruel. By the time the city fell and fires died down, the animals had already begun the next chapter. Some turned feral, forming packs that claimed ruins as their own. Others were taken by soldiers. A few those, cared for by women like Yael, were led out, one by one, into the hills. Their paw prints, the first to touch soil not soaked in ash. In the quiet that followed the war cries, those small lives hummed softly, and in that hush, healing began. Paw prints in the dust. How animals nursed a dying city. They came without warning. At first, it was just a few, a limping cat appearing on the steps of a ruined bakery, a donkey nosing through a pile of scorched barley, the occasional shadow of a falcon high overhead. But as Jerusalem weakened under siege, the animals came forward as if called by some ancient contract. And strangely, as human hope ebbed, these creatures emerged not only to scavenge, but to soothe. There were stories of a large, brindle-colored mastiff who would walk the perimeter of the western wall at dusk. No one knew its owner, though several claimed he had once belonged to a Roman officer slain in an ambush. The dog, scarred and solemn, stood watch each evening as if guarding something sacred. Mothers taught their children to greet him respectfully. Some swore they healed faster after touching his head. In the Hinnom Valley, known for its ghost stories and refuse heaps, a group of children reportedly found an injured gazelle. They tended to it in secret, gathering herbs and water, creating a little pen out of scrap wood and prayers. When it recovered, it didn't flee. Instead, it lingered, peering at dawn near the city gates, disappearing into the mist like a spirit. The children named it Malak, Angel. Healing during wartime was scarce, uneven, and often driven by desperation. Yet, amidst bloodletting and makeshift medicine, the presence of animals began to influence more than just moods. A physician named Levi wrote that his treatments failed until he began to allow patients to rest with animals nearby. A dove's coo calmed fevers. The rhythmic breathing of a goat reduced the panic of seizures. A kitten purring against the chest steadied erratic hearts. In an abandoned schoolhouse turned field hospital, scribes kept notes, survivor accounts, remedies, verses, and within them were records of animals being prescribed, not herbs, not chance creatures. Let Miriam be given the she-cat, one note read. She dreams of death each night. The cat will hold it at bay. These prescriptions weren't folklore. They were based on observation, on trust in the unexplainable. Among the zealots, whose hardened hearts seemed immune to comfort, stories surfaced of fierce warriors softening in the presence of birds. A commander known only as Barak was notorious for brutality, but after finding a nest of fledglings in the rafters of a burned-out inn, he ordered the building spared. He fed them daily. One day, when a scout returned injured, Barak laid him beneath the nest. If they live, he said, so will he. Roman writings tell a parallel tale, albeit with detached amusement. Tacitus records how a group of Jewish healers insisted on using animals as part of their rituals. He mocks them, of course, but includes enough detail to make us wonder. He describes a child with boils being placed between two oxen, believed to absorb the fever. He notes how war dogs were made to sleep beside those with broken limbs, the warmth encouraging the bones to mend. Even the birds carried messages of peace. Pigeons released by desperate lovers or fleeing families often returned not to their homes, but to the temple ruins, circling as if lost. Their cries became a daily chorus, one that reminded the people that movement still existed, that the city breathed. But perhaps the most poignant healing story came from the tunnels. In a forgotten aqueduct, a woman named Dinah established a secret clinic. It was small, damp, lit by oil and faith. She took in the sick, the broken, and always she had animals. Chickens for warmth, a goat who sensed convulsions before they began, a lizard that perched near the dying and never left until the final breath. When Roman soldiers eventually found the clinic, they were struck dumb. The commander, unsure whether to destroy or preserve it, chose silence. He posted a guard and told no one. For weeks after the fall of Jerusalem, the tunnel remained untouched, protected by a strange ceasefire. Healing, after all, is a force even empire learns to fear. By the time Dinah left the tunnel, emaciated eyes like coals, she carried nothing but a ferret curled in her arms. The creature had stayed awake for 3 nights while a child thrashed from infection. The child survived. The Romans let Dinah go. These were not myths. These were acts of resistance, quiet revolutions against despair. Animals were not tools or trophies. They were partners. They were prayer. Beasts of burden, spirits of mercy. Long before Jerusalem burned, the people whispered of a bond sacred and unspoken between the creatures of the earth and the ones who walked upon it. This covenant, forgotten in peacetime, was rediscovered in war. As the siege deepened and the walls grew colder with silence, animals became more than comforters. They became comrades, healers, and in rare cases, saviors. Mules and donkeys, long abused and overworked in the city's bustling markets, took on new roles. They were used not only to haul debris or carry water, but to assist the wounded. A record from a physician's scroll noted that some animals refused to move when patients lay bleeding on the street, as if they understand pain, he wrote, and refused to step through it. A zealot runner told of an alley where wounded fighters dragged themselves after failed missions. The alley, narrow and dark, became known as the Mule's Vigil. Each morning, a single mule stood there, braying, until someone came to carry the injured. None knew where it came from. None dared kill it. It was as if it had appointed itself guardian of the fallen. Cats continued to fill homes and temples with their patient, rhythmic presence. One boy who lost his entire family in a night raid refused to speak till a black cat appeared, curling into his lap. He named it Navi, Prophet. Over weeks, as Navi remained by his side, the boy began to whisper again, first to the cat, then to the priest, then to the wind. Dogs became especially important in the city's underground networks. Small, agile ones were trained to carry messages. A young girl named Yael taught her terrier to run letters from her father in the upper city to a healer sheltering in the aqueduct ruins. The dog returned each night with herbs tucked in its collar. One night, Yael's father was captured. The dog, confused and frightened, stayed by the prison gate for 2 days. A Roman soldier took pity, giving it scraps. When the soldier saw a wound on its paw, he knelt to tend its hand, found the letter. It simply read, "I am still here." The soldier returned it to Yael, along with a jar of balm and a silent nod. Horses, though fewer in number, and largely owned by the elite or Roman legion, were remembered for their roles in evacuations. An elder named Ezra, who could barely walk, was smuggled out of the lower city on the back of a white stallion stolen from a Roman villa. The horse, once adorned with silver reins and groomed daily, now bore dirt and blood, but it carried Ezra to safety and vanished into the wilderness. Rats and mice, too, were part of this strange symphony. Though hated for spreading disease, a few were strangely adopted. A blind woman claimed she was alerted to incoming fire by a rat that tugged at her shawl and ran. Others noted that mice would flee buildings seconds before they collapsed, giving just enough warning to escape. Even insects were not excluded. Bees, nurtured in clay hives, hidden in temple corners, were used by herbalists. Their honey was precious, a balm for burns, an elixir for coughs, a rare taste of sweetness in bitter days. One beekeeper risked death weekly to harvest it. He fed the weak with droplets. His hands were covered in stings. He called the bees his army. A particularly moving tale was that of Rivka, a woman accused of witchcraft after surviving the plague with her entire family. Her secret, she claimed, was the blessing of an owl who perched above her home. The owl, a creature feared and often hunted, never left. She believed it drove away death. When soldiers came to burn her house, they saw the owlland turned back. In the final days of the siege, as Jerusalem prepared to fall, the animals remained. They did not flee. As fire consumed homes and temples, a chorus of howls, cries, coos, and roars filled the smoke-choked air. It was said that even the most hardened soldier wept at the sight of a lion-emaciated regal standing atop a crumbled wall, staring toward the Mount of Olives. The siege ended. The records, scattered and broken, tell us little of what became of these creatures. But the stories passed through generations, whispered at bedtime, and now written in fading ink remain, not as fairy tales, as truth with fur, feathers, and claws. Guardians of bone and spirit, the animal afterlives in the hushed aftermath of conquest, when the swords were sheathed and the wails of the wounded faded into ash. The survivors of Jerusalem, both man and beast, faced a new question. What came next? This final chapter in the tale of animals during the siege is not about war, nor even healing. It is about what remains, the afterlife of animals, not just as myth or memory, but as symbols of resilience and continuity. In Jewish tradition, while animals do not possess immortal souls in the same way humans are believed to, they are not without spiritual purpose. After the siege, as rebuilding began amid dust and ruins, animals were honored in unexpected ways. Children who had lost everything sculpted lions and owls from rubble and charred wood. These makeshift effigies were placed on altars, in corners of tents, or tied with twine to the wrists of orphans. Each one told a story: a horse that carried them to safety, a cat that stayed when no one else did, a dove seen moments before an arrow flew. A small community in the shadow of the Second Temple ruins began carving a bestiary into the rock walls. It was not decorative, was votive. Carvings of goats, eagles, oxen, and even lizards filled the stone. Beneath each one was a name. Shavi, who warned us, read one. Miri's fox, who brought bread, said another. Over time, the wall became a pilgrimage site. Mothers brought their children to touch the lion and whisper prayers of courage. New rituals formed. One involved releasing a dove at the sunrise on every Sabbath to honor those lost, but also to bless the skies. Another practice involved leaving small bowls of water or crumbs on windowsills in memory of the creatures who had shared their meager sustenance during the siege. This quiet tradition continued for generations. Even when Romans banned Jewish customs, they did not understand this one, and so it endured. The tales spread further. In Alexandria, Babylon, and eventually Rome itself. Jews in exile told of the animals of Jerusalem. A lion who refused to eat a zealot prisoner and instead lay beside him. A stork who landed on a rooftop moments before a Roman firebomb missed its mark. In time, these stories were mixed with myth, but their kernel remained. They became part of a shared memory of grief, resistance, and unlikely alliances. Among Roman soldiers, two strange recollections were recorded. A centurion named Lucanus wrote to his sister in Gaul about a golden dog that ran into battle and dragged back a child. He described the scene not as miracle, but mystery. "It looked into my eyes," he wrote, "and I felt shame." Some philosophers debated whether the siege had awakened an ancient pact between man and beasts, something dormant, now momentarily restored. A visiting scribe from Ephesus compiled a scroll titled The Testament of Beasts, collecting over 300 stories from Jerusalem and its survivors. In it, he mused, perhaps, when gods fall silent and kings turn to dust, the animals remain to keep time and truth. Not all was reverent. In the years after the siege, the Romans displayed Jerusalem's animals as trophies. A bear taken from the temple garden was paraded through Damascus in chains. It roared not in rage, but grief, said an old merchant. Some whispered that the Romans who mistreated the animals were later cursed. True or not, these rumors spread fear and quiet reverence. As the Second Temple's final stones were scattered, a new generation rose, born from blood and soot. They inherited these stories, half remembered, half holy. A boy might wear a pendant shaped like a fox. A woman might tattoo the wings of a bee on her wrist. These small gestures carried immense meaning, not idols, but memories. Over time, these traditions evolved into symbols found in Jewish mysticism, early Kabbalah, and even Christian imagery. The lion, already symbolic of Judah, now also represented sacrifice, the dove of peace, but also of warning. The owl became associated with silent wisdom, and the fox once cunning now clever survival. In the Talmud, subtle references emerge, teachings about kindness to animals, reflections on their loyalty and intuition. These writings may not mention the siege, but the cultural echoes are there, embedded in the way later rabbis spoke of mercy and mutual care. In modern Jerusalem, archaeologists have found bones of cats buried with small tokens. Amulets depicting stags, dogs, and eagles have been unearthed near ancient homes. They testify to lives lived closely with animals, not just functionally, but affectionately. In quiet cemeteries, stones mark where pets were buried by people who remembered not the empire that ruled them, but the creature that comforted them. Today, when the city breathes with new tension and old ghosts, one might still see a child leave crumbs for a bird on a window ledge, or a vet whisper a blessing over a sick donkey. These gestures are not just acts of kindness, they are echoes of animals who did not run, who stayed, carried, warned, healed, and remembered, whose stories, silent, loyal, enduring, outlived the fire, the swords, and even the names of kings. Ashes in the loaf, remembrance baked in bread in the neighborhoods of modern Jerusalem, where glass storefronts reflect the midday sun and scooters hum down narrow alleys. Some things remain unchanged, like the scent of fresh bread. In Mahane Yehuda Market, the aroma drifts through the air, curling past piles of pomegranates and fragrant herbs. It leads you to stalls where vendors, many descended from families who lived through generations of exile and return, place braided challah, sesame-to-stead Jerusalem bagels, and spicy Yemenite kabani onto worn wooden trays. These are not just foods, they are stories, folded and baked into each golden crust. Because in this city, where history is never entirely past, bread remembers. The tradition of baking bread in Jerusalem stretches back thousands of years, rooted in biblical practices and deepened through the trauma of siege, exile, and return. The very act of kneading dough and watching it rise became, over centuries, an act of resistance and memory. Even during the brutal siege of 70 CE, when food was scarce and death abundant, people tried to bake, not because they had the flour or fire to do so, but because it connected them to a life that once was, and a hope that it might be again. Archaeologists have unearthed ancient ovens buried beneath the Temple Mount's shadow. Some still bear scorch marks from the Roman fires. Nearby, clay tablets detail offerings of fine flour and oil, remnants of both religious rites and everyday life. One charred crust, carbon dated to the 1st century, was found nestled beside the bones of a young child in what had once been a kitchen. The bread had not been eaten. It had been placed, perhaps in mourning, or perhaps as a prayer. Today, in the traditions of Shabbat, bread holds ceremonial importance. Challah, the sweet braided loaf, is covered with an embroidered cloth until it's time for the blessing. This act echoes the story of manna from heaven hidden until morning, but it also symbolizes survival. During the siege, families used old tunics and prayer shawls to keep the dust from their loaves. The cloth became sacred by necessity. In Jerusalem's Ethiopian Jewish community, the baking of dabo, spiced, round breadies done with whispered blessings from grandmothers who remember their own exodus across deserts and persecution. For them, bread is both feast and footprint. In Armenian quarters, lavash is slapped against the hot walls of cylindrical ovens. Each slap a memory passed down from ancestors who fled pogroms and found refuge within Jerusalem's stone embrace. Every layer of ash in those ovens is like a stratum of history, siege, sanctuary, and solace. These breads do not exist in isolation. They intertwine with rituals, the dipping in salt to recall tears, the tearing of loaves during mourning, the baking of 7 loaves for 7 days after a death. In Jerusalem, to bake is to remember, and so it continues. In times of peace, bread celebrates. In times of war, it consoles. During COVID lockdowns, Jerusalemites turned to baking with renewed fervor. Flour ran short, but neighbors shared. Online groups traded recipes with ancestral roots. A woman in Gilo posted her grandmother's recipe for siege bread hard as stone, made with lentil flour and honey. "It fed us then," she wrote, "and it feeds our strength now." In Jerusalem's culinary schools, young chefs are now studying not just technique, but tradition. One course, titled Memory in the Crust, explores the symbolism of bread through time, from the matzah of Exodus to the pan de morto of Sephardic exiles. The students bake and reflect. They interview elders, compile oral histories, and bake loaves in reconstructed clay ovens, just as their ancestors might have done. Bread, it turns out, is not just sustenance. It is survival. It is faith. It is testimony. In this city, where even silence echoes, a crust of bread can whisper 1,000 years of memory. And so, as twilight settles on Jerusalem and the muezzin's calls mingle with Shabbat songs, the ovens continue to burn. Flour is kneaded by hands, both young and wrinkled. The smell rises. and in each loaf the city remembers. Stones in the stream, ritual baths, and the water that remembers walk the streets of the old city. And you'll see doors leading downward, stone steps worn smooth by centuries of bare feet. Beneath the surface of Jerusalem lies an ancient world of water, purification, and spiritual preparation. These are the mikvah baths carved from bedrock, still whispering stories of cleansing and hope. Before the siege of 70 CE, it's estimated that over 100 ritual baths existed in and around Jerusalem's Second Temple. Some were private, built into the courtyards of affluent homes. Others were communal, positioned along pilgrimage routes or near the Temple Mount, where worshippers immersed before entering holy space. These mikvot followed precise guidelines: living water, untouched by vessels, flowing naturally from springs or collected rain. Archaeologists have unearthed dozens of them, small square pools, often with partitions separating entry and exit. The steps descend in odd numbers, often 7 or 13. Some have handrails, others smooth channels where water once trickled. But during the siege, these sacred pools ran dry or filled with ash. The Romans severed aqueducts and burned systems. Still, the people adapted. Hidden mikvah were maintained underground, water drawn at night, guarded like treasure. Immersion became dangerous, done in silence, in darkness, with watchers posted. Purity wasn't just religious, it became defiance. One scroll, found in the Dead Sea region, likely brought by a fleeing priest, speaks of the bath under the olive tree. It's unclear whether this refers to a literal mikveh or a coded location, but it highlights how central the act remained, even when its physicality was stripped. In Jewish tradition, immersion marks change, birth, conversion, grief, marriage. After the siege, survivors rebuilt their lives one ritual at a time. The mikveh became a symbol of renewal. Families constructed them anew, even in exile. In Babylon, Alexandria, and later Spain and Poland, community centers always included one evan before they built synagogues. In modern Jerusalem, some mikvah remain in use, nestled behind ancient doors. Others have become heritage sites, open for visitors and scholars. The most famous lies near the Davidson Center, where pilgrims once walked. Tourists peer down into the silent stone, unaware that generations once bared their fears and faith within those walls. But the spirit of the mikveh continues beyond those physical places. In secular homes, symbolic immersions happen under showers before Shabbat. Artists have created installations using water, light, and song to evoke the experience of ritual purity. One exhibit, titled "Depths, Remember," allows participants to walk through a dimly lit tunnel where recorded voices recite blessings and griefs, mimicking the descent into water. Some reinterpret the tradition. Feminist Jewish groups have reclaimed the mikveh as a space of empowerment, not just purification. Survivors of trauma have found solace in private immersion ceremonies. LGBTQ+ Jews have used mikvah to mark transitions and reclaim identities. In this way, the tradition bends but does not break. Water remains sacred in Jerusalem. During Sukkot, the ancient ritual of Simchat Beit HaShoev, the water-drawing festival, has been revived. Joyous processions carry vessels of water through the streets, honoring the link between rain, blessing, and spiritual purity. Children toss petals into fountains. Elders recite psalms near cisterns that have outlasted empires. And sometimes, In the silence of dawn, someone descends ancient steps. The stone is cold, the water still. A breath is held, then the plunge. For a moment, there is only silence and the echo of memory. In a city where dust remembers footsteps, and stone remembers fire, water remembers healing, and in the heart of Jerusalem, the ritual bath endures not as relic, but as promise. The threads of the fallen, weaving memory into cloth in the alleyways of Jerusalem's old city. Beyond the golden domes and bustling spice stalls, the threads of memory stretch taut on looms both ancient and new. Among the shops of Armenian stitchers, Orthodox tailors, and Arab embroiderers, cloth is not just commodity, is memory. Every thread carries a name, every knot holds a prayer, and every woven fragment, in its silence, speaks. Before the Roman siege of 70 CE, textiles marked social and spiritual identity. Priests at the Second Temple wore robes of linen and blue-purple wool dyed with teklit, a rare color derived from sea snails. Their vestments shimmered under torchlight, described meticulously in the Torah. The ephod breastplate, sash, and tunic, each stitched with precision, each fabric bearing sacred intent. After the temple fell and Jerusalem burned, these sacred garments vanished, but their memory remained. In exile, Jews began weaving inuwafen without access to the materials once deemed holy. Instead, they passed down knowledge orally: how to tie tzitzit, how to spin wool from local sheep, how to recreate the lost teklit. Entire generations carried these skills, not on parchment, but in practice. The loom became a sanctuary. In the centuries following, every diaspora had its textile rituals. In Yemen, wedding shawls were embroidered with silver thread and passed from mother to daughter. In Poland, talitot bore intricate lace and fringe unique to village styles. In Morocco, women stitched coded prayers into the hems of their sons' bar mitzvah garments. Even under persecution, the act of stitching was defiance. Every garment said, "We are still here." In Jerusalem today, those threads are being rediscovered. Walk down Rechov Agrippas, and you'll find a workshop where Orthodox Jews extract blue dye from Murex trunculus, just as their ancestors may have done. They believe this rediscovered teklit revives a broken chain. Some wear it in their tzitzit, others stitch it only for special occasions. But all see it as fulfillment, tradition reawakened. In East Jerusalem, women embroider keffiyehs and ceremonial dresses with motifs inherited over 300 years. Their fingers move with ancestral rhythm: cypress for longevity, pomegranates for fertility, and fish for protection. For many, it's more than craft, it's preservation against the tide of modern erasure. At the intersection of these worlds, interfaith workshops have emerged. Jewish and Arab artisans gather in shared spaces to weave stories through cloth. One collective, called Shalshilit, chain in Hebrew, produces tapestries combining Hebrew psalms and Arabic poetry, stitched into linen. Each tapestry tells a dual story: siege and sanctuary, exile and homecoming, fire and resilience. In Jerusalem's synagogues, the Torah scroll remains robed. Its mantelofen, velvet or silk, is embroidered with names, dates, and dedications. After the Holocaust, many survivors commissioned new mantles using fragments from their homeland garments. Some incorporated cloth from wedding dresses, others from uniforms of lost loved ones. In this way, the Torah did not only carry divine word, it carried the memory of those who once danced beneath its verses. In recent years, this tradition has expanded into art and activism. One exhibit at the Tower of David Museum displayed modern talitot woven from recycled military uniforms. Each one bore embroidered psalms, alongside names of those lost in conflict. The message was clear. Even in war, cloth can carry hope. Young designers in Jerusalem's art academies are now blending ancient technique with modern expression. One fashion student created a wedding dress stitched with 613 knots each, representing a commandment. Another crafted a prayer shawl using threads dipped in the Dead Sea, symbolizing grief and endurance. But not all traditions return in grandeur. Some reappear quietly in kitchens and closets. A grandmother folds a threadbare tallit into her grandson's backpack before army service. A mother saves embroidered baby clothes from generations ago. A father ties a cloth napkin as a kippah on a child's head when none can be found. These acts are small but enduring. In them, the siege is always present, and so is survival. At Jerusalem's Yad Vashem, a display case holds a hand-stitched ark curtain from a destroyed synagogue in Hungary, smuggled across Europe, restored in Jerusalem. It now hangs behind glass, but its threads have not faded. They shine because they are remembered, and still the looms spin. In a city where stone remembers fire, and bread remembers famine, cloth remembers hands, not just the famous ones, but the quiet ones, the women who stitched at night, the children who learned to weave between raids, the old men who tied tzitzi with trembling fingers. The siege of Jerusalem was meant to silence a people, but instead, the threads carried them forward, across deserts and oceans, from Babylon to Brooklyn, from Lod to London, the stitches held, and in Jerusalem they still do. Ink and ash, the living scrolls of survival Jerusalem, breathes through parchment, along its winding alleys and shaded courtyards. Scribes still bend over desks, their quills dipping rhythmically into wells of black ink. In this ancient city, where stone testifies and bread remembers, it is the scroll that speaks with a voice both divine and human. Every letter, carefully shaped, carries the burden of continuity, a line unbroken since the days before the siege. Before the cataclysm of 70 CE, scrolls were not merely religious artifacts, they were lifelines, kept in homes, synagogues, and the temple itself. These scrolls contained law, lore, and lineage. To lose a scroll was to lose history. During the siege, as flames devoured homes and sanctuaries, Jews risked everything to protect their Torahs. Some buried them in earthen jars. Others carried fragments through tunnels or sewed pieces into their clothing. In the ashes of Jerusalem, scrolls survived because people refused to let them vanish. One fragment, found centuries later in the Judean desert, bore only a single verse burnt around the edges, almost unreadable. But that single verse echoed the yearning of an entire people, and you shall teach them diligently to your children. Today, the tradition of Sofreta, sacred art of scribal writing, continues in Jerusalem with unwavering dedication. The rules are ancient, stringent, black ink made from gall nuts, parchment from kosher animals, no corrections once the name of God is written. Each Torah scroll takes about a year to complete, often longer. The scribes, or sofarim, are trained not only in calligraphy, but in spiritual discipline. Each word must be written with intention, each line a prayer in motion. In the neighborhood of Mishiarim, you'll find small studios tucked between bookstores and bakeries. Inside, the scent of ink mixes with incense. A scribe hums psalms softly as he shapes each letter aleph, bet, gimel. His tools are simple: reed or feather, inkstone, ruled parchment. But his task is monumental: to ensure the unbroken chain of transmission. Scrolls are not confined to Torah. Megillat, like the scroll of Lamentations, are read on Tisha B'Av to commemorate the destruction of the first and second temples. The text is haunting. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. It's chanted slowly, with a melody that weeps, in candlelit rooms and public plazas. In modern Jerusalem, entire communities gather each year outside the Western Wall to read these words. Children sit cross-legged, eyes wide. Elders sway as tears mingle with memory. This is not mere ceremony, it is tradition as embodiment. The Ashkenazi and Sephardi traditions preserve different styles of calligraphy, different flourishes and spacing, yet all agree the scroll is sacred. In the Yemenite tradition, inherited from ancient Judea, scrolls are kept in elaborate wooden cases and read aloud with intricate melodic chants. In each community, the scroll is not simply an object, it is a heartbeat. Survivors of war have often turned to the scroll as both symbol and sanctuary. After the Holocaust, dozens of rescued Torah scrolls arrived in Jerusalem, some torn, some scorched, many incomplete. They were lovingly restored by hand. Missing lines were rewritten, tears were stitched. One scroll, found in a Polish barn beneath hay, now sits in a yeshiva in West Jerusalem. Each week, it is read aloud, its survival a quiet defiance against those who tried to erase it, and new scrolls are born. In Jerusalem's scribal schools, young men and women study the shapes of letters like sacred architecture. One program invites soldiers, after finishing their service, to write a single letter in a communal scroll. In this way, the defense of the city and its spiritual heritage intertwine: sword and scroll, memory and ink. Even secular artists have begun embracing the aesthetic and philosophical power of the scroll. One exhibit at the Israel Museum featured scrolls composed of refugee stories, written on parchment in calligraphic Hebrew, Arabic, and Amharic. Visitors turned the scrolls by hand, slowly uncovering narratives of loss, longing, and belonging. Another artist wrote the entire book of Isaiah on a silk scroll with threads dyed in colors of Jerusalem, stone rose, gold, and gray. Technology has not displaced the scroll, it has extended it. Digital scrolls now accompany services, projected on walls or displayed on phones. But the physical scroll remains irreplaceable. In moments of crisis, people seek it. When missiles fell in the south, a community gathered around their Torah scroll in a bomb shelter and sang together. In the hush of trauma, parchment spoke peace. In Jerusalem, tradition does not rest. Each generation adds its ink. A scribe dies, and another begins their training. A scroll is damaged, and someone repairs it letter by letter, tear by tear. The process is slow, almost invisible. Yet, over centuries, it forms a lineage more resilient than stone. Back in the old city, a father lifts his son to kiss a Torah mantle. The boy presses his lips gently to the silver crown. Not knowing the full weight it carries, sieges survived, fires endured, hands held steady through darkness. The scroll has outlasted emperors. It has crossed deserts and oceans. It has been hidden in caves, buried in walls, smuggled in suitcases, and lifted in triumph. And still, in Jerusalem, it is written anew. In this city, where every breath is layered with past and present, A single stroke of ink can bind generations. Threads of light, the festivals that keep the city awake. Jerusalem, ever ancient and ever new, is not only a city of grief, is a city of joy. And nowhere is this joy more vividly expressed than in its festivals. These celebrations, rooted in centuries of tradition, bind past and present in rituals that glow with light, song, and the shared hope of renewal. Each tradition, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Armenian, Druze, Samaritan, celebrates its sacred calendar in ways that transform the city's rhythms. The narrow streets swell with processions, the air thrums with chant and drum, and windows fill with candlelight. To walk through Jerusalem during a festival is to step into time layered upon time, a pageant of devotion that transcends empires, wars, and wounds. For the Jewish community, the calendar is marked by a cycle of remembering and rejoicing. Passover comes first in spring, retelling the Exodus story through a meal, the Seder. In Jerusalem, the city pulses with family gatherings, the aroma of bitter herbs and sweet carousel drifting from windows. The Haggadah is read aloud. Children ask the 4 questions, and somewhere in every home, someone whispers the wish. Next year in Jerusalem, Shavuot, 7 weeks later, marks the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. At the Western Wall, thousands gather at midnight to study scripture until dawn. Young and old arrive in waves, wearing white, a tradition of milk and honey-based foods. Cheesecakes, blintzes, sweet dairy dishes connects body and spirit. The early hours of the morning glow with both sunrise and study. Then comes Sukkot, the festival of booths, when families build temporary dwellings outdoors to recall the Israelites' journey in the desert. In Jerusalem, balconies bloom with handmade sukkahs, draped in fabric, decorated with fruit. Children sleep under the stars, lulled to sleep by ancient stories. The whole city becomes a garden of memory and shelter. Hanukkah, the festival of lights, brings flame to darkness. Menorahs glimmer in every window. The scent of fried dosifganiot fills the air. Children spin dreidels on cobbled stones. And at the Herva synagogue, thousands gather to witness the lighting of the giant menorah. The miracle of oil from the Maccabean revolt is retold in every spark. The living wall. When past and present pray together in Jerusalem, memory is a living thing, an echo that walks beside the present. And there is perhaps no better symbol of this than the Western Wall, the Kotel, where past and present pray shoulder to shoulder. It is not merely a place of tradition, is tradition, inscribed in stone and carried in the voices of millions. Each day, from dawn until well past dusk, the wall greets an endless procession of souls. Men in prayer, shawls swaying with psalms. Tourists whispering curiosity. Children pressing notes into cracks. Widows murmuring names of the departed. There are those who arrive barefoot, as though treading holy ground, and those who arrive in wheelchairs, faces tilted toward the sky. Here, there is no single posture for devotion, only presence. The wall is all that remains of the Second Temple, destroyed by Rome in 70 CE. But even in ruin, it is not silent. For generations, Jews faced it from faraway lands, saying, "If I forget you, O Jerusalem, ... And when exile kept them distant, they planted memories close. Synagogues across the world placed their arcs toward Jerusalem. In Morocco, India, Poland, and Persia, Jews saved a corner for the Wallin tapestry in tile, in dream. Returning to Jerusalem was not always a choice. For centuries, empires forbade it. Crusaders turned synagogues into stables. Ottoman officials taxed pilgrims. The British imposed quotas. And in 1948, after the division of Jerusalem, Jews were forbidden from approaching the wall altogether. Barbed wire ran through the city's heart, and prayers became longing. When Israeli forces reclaimed the old city in 1967, the photographs became iconic. Soldiers weeping against the wall, pressing lips to its stones. In minutes, memory became flesh. Tradition surged forward, alive again. The plaza was cleared. Streets were opened. And for the first time in centuries, the wall became accessible to all. But accessibility is not the same as unity. The wall today reflects the tensions of a diverse people. The Orthodox hold sway at the main plaza, where men and women pray in separate sections. In the early morning, the men's side fills with tallit-clad worshippers, Torah scrolls unrolled like ancient maps. On the women's side, prayers rise in softer tones, no less fervent. Debates rage over who belongs where. The group Women of the Wall fights for equal rights to read Torah aloud, to wear prayer shawls, to raise their voices. Protesters jeer, police intervene, and the wall watches, indifferent and eternal. In response, a new section, the egalitarian plaza, was opened further south. Here, families can pray together, unsegregated. Here, bar and bat mitzvahs unfold beneath open sky. And still, the stones receive the prayers. But the wall is not only Jewish. Christian pilgrims visit in awe, some tracing the way of the cross just streets away. Muslims, too, recognize its nearness to Al-Aqsa, the noble sanctuary. And so, the wall is a paradox, a Jewish remnant, a shared longing, a geopolitical flashpoint. In modern times, it is also digital. A live stream broadcasts the wall 24/7, watched by millions around the world. Online services let users submit prayers. Virtually, rabbis place printed notes between stones. During the pandemic, this was how the diaspora stayed connected, by fiber optic faith. On Tisha B'Av, the wall becomes a theater of lament. Thousands gather barefoot, chanting lamentations by candlelight. On Jerusalem Day, it becomes a stage of celebration, flags and dances sweeping the plaza. On Yom Kippur, it is silent, but for the sobs of penitence. And on countless private days' anniversaries, illnesses, hopes, people come with folded papers and folded hearts. Tradition here is not only about rituals, it is about presence. The act of standing at the wall is a ritual in itself, of remembering, hoping, belonging, of saying, I am here, and so were my ancestors, so will my children be. Every stone is a witness, every note is a petition, every tear is a verse in the city's ongoing psalm. Jerusalem lives not only in its festivals, its grief, its scholars, but in its traditions, practiced daily, carried quietly, in the call of the shofar, the scent of baking challah, the clatter of pomegranates in Mahane Yehuda, in the candlelit vigils of Christians in Gethsemane, in the prayers echoing from minarets across hills at dawn. Tradition is what survives when all else falls. And in Jerusalem, it has never ceased, not through war, not through exile, not through doubt. So, when you see someone at the wall, forehead pressed to stone, know that you are seeing not just a person, but a tradition, alive, enduring. And in that moment, Jerusalem prays to